So we'll go ahead and get started now. Hi to everyone who I have not met before. I am Lauren Block. I am a co-director for Pathways to Resilience. Today's session is called It Starts With Us, Building a Trauma Responsive and Resilient Workplace. We have three amazing speakers: Justin Brown, Secretary of Oklahoma Human Services; Vicki Choites, Director of the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce, Trauma and Resilience at Work Team, and then Audrey Smolkin, Executive Director of the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma. For those of you who have not joined us before, these learning network sessions happen every month. We change topics and you can register on our website. These are informal in nature. So I am the moderator for the conversation that we'll be having, but you should feel free to use the chat and ask questions as we go. We don't wait until the end for Q&A. We'll just keep on talking. So please use the chat. You can raise your hand, or if you want to ask a question out loud, you can indicate that as well and go off mute and ask that as well. So we do have a lot of people on today, which is fantastic. We're going to keep admitting people, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So for those of you who have not joined us before, you'll note that we talk about trauma responsiveness and not just being trauma informed. And so while there is not a universally accepted definition of trauma informed versus trauma responsive, we at Pathways to Resilience believe that trauma informed generally seeks to have an organization-wide awareness of trauma and an understanding of how trauma can impact individuals, children, and families, as well as communities. But that being informed really isn't enough. We really think that it's important to take it to the next level and to ensure that we're incorporating universal precautions into all the programs, practices, and protocols that we are following, the 3 Ps there, as well as in our daily interactions. So when we're talking about trauma responsive, we mean an organization that's going to take active measures to prevent and address trauma and re-traumatization internally and for the individuals they serve. We know that our audience is a combination of people today. We have folks who work in the trauma responsive space full time. We also have HR professionals and others who are coming. And so we know that you're each coming with a different lens and may have different questions. Our goal for today is really to share actionable insights of how you can move forward in the next steps that you can take in your organization. And again, we welcome you to use the chat. So if you're hearing things that you like or where you have a great example of something you've done, please share it. Similarly, if you've got a question, how could I do this better? Or I'm up against this challenge, feel free to share that as well. This again is being recorded and will be available also afterwards. We should have it up within a week or so. So that you can share it with others. So our speakers today represent organizations that are supporting workforces in becoming trauma responsive, and an organization that's adopting trauma responsive principles itself at the state level. So we're going to start today with Vicki. So could you briefly introduce yourself and your role within the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce?
Absolutely. Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Lizzie, and everybody for being here. So as Lauren said, I am the director of the Trauma and Resilience at Work team at CSW. I'm off mute, right? Yes, okay. CSW is a national nonprofit organization that works in workforce development. We define that broadly to include job training, employment, education, human services, et cetera, to improve economic mobility and racial equity. At CSW, our Trauma and Resilience at Work team works with federal, state, and local workforce development and other human services and post-secondary education agencies and organizations to really assist them on their journey to becoming more trauma responsive and resilience building. So for example, we've worked with the Detroit at Work public workforce development system for 2 years now, providing training to the whole system as well as organizational coaching across all of their career centers in the city. We've worked with a couple of New Hampshire substance use disorder treatment centers in a pilot program. We provided training in Missouri, Massachusetts, Dallas, other cities and states. And we're actually doing a webinar for the U.S. Department of Labor on May 2nd. So we work at all those levels, and we really focus on workforce development agencies and organizations, but we define that pretty broadly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Justin, can you introduce yourself and tell us about the work of Oklahoma's Department of Human Services to become trauma informed?
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and share some work that we're really proud of. So the Oklahoma Department of Human Services really serves in 7 program areas, 2 of which, as I was thinking about this conversation, are really important. Of course, the first is the child welfare system, in which we operate, of course, foster care and adoption and all of the systems that engage with that. Which, as everyone on the call here recognizes and understands, is a system full of trauma. We also operate the social safety net programs, which for me, likely one of the biggest drivers of trauma is poverty, and we have an opportunity to really address poverty from a systemic approach. So ultimately, as I came in, we started to build a process called Finding Our True North, and we created 3 to 5 guiding principles for each division. But we also created 9 agency-wide principles. And the first one is to become the largest ever hope-centered organization. And so it was incumbent upon us, as we embraced that strategy, is to really build a whole continuum around trauma and the science of hope. And so we started with the really sort of 3 key components to that continuum. The first is honestly just the resilience film. There are so many people who just don't have a basic understanding of toxic stress and trauma. And so really creating a venue for our workforce to see the film, engage in conversation around it, as well as our community at large. There's a fantastic foundation partner in Oklahoma that sponsors that. The second is understanding brain science. And so the deeper you get into our system, the more that we have to sort of provide tools for you that help you to build your trauma responsive muscles. And so the second is this conversation around brain science that allows for us to understand where the people that we're working with, where they're coming from, and sort of put ourselves on their side of the table to be partners because we recognize the science. And then the third I mentioned is the science of hope. The science of hope for us is the belief that tomorrow can be better than today, and I have the power to make it so. So the idea there is agency. And so as we understand the concept of trauma, we build our understanding of brain science. And then the third is we embrace the tools in the science of hope, primarily the idea of goal setting, the creation of pathways, and the driving of willpower and agency for the people we serve. We have begun to see some outcomes that are pretty fantastic. So for us, we started with our workforce and to build this culture around the understanding of trauma and the science of hope. And now we're working much deeper into the system, in the spaces in which we engage with the customer at the end of our services, and developing a framework for embracing trauma responsiveness and the science of hope.
Thanks so much, Justin. Audrey, let's hear from you. Tell us a little bit about who you are and where you work and what you all do and how you work across sectors.
Thanks, Lauren. So first, I want to say thank you to Pathways for pulling us all together. And then I really want to express a lot of gratitude to every single one of you guys on the call. It looks like we're closing in on about 185 people who have chosen to dedicate some time today to really learning about trauma and resilience and supporting the workforce that you work with, and hopefully supporting yourself by looking at some of those solutions. So I'm really grateful to you, especially this far into our Zoom world. Sometimes I know that people get exhausted by the thought of logging into yet one more Zoom and nodding at all of our talking heads, but I'm really grateful to hear you all and know that we are all in this together as we try to move towards a better tomorrow. And I especially want to thank my co-presenters, because I already feel inspired by things that I have heard from Vicki and Justin. And I was already scribbling down like, oh, that would be so great for my state. So let me talk a little bit about my state. I'm in Massachusetts, and we are the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma. We were founded about 14 months ago with funds that we got from our legislature that really said, go out there and look about how we can get to child well-being. Massachusetts is a great state for children in general. So if you look at the really big picture of how are kids doing in our state, and children are both my passion and my heart, but also our focus area in general, although we're going to talk about a lot of adult solutions because adults take care of kids. But I did want to just share that we really do focus on child well-being. And that means looking at trauma, right? And that means looking at resilience, but it is, how do we get to well-being? Our goal is not just trauma reduction. Our goal is really healthier, happier children, and society. So the way we do that now is we work with child-serving organizations and systems to become trauma-informed. As Lauren said, that's sort of the starting point, and then more responsive. And we do it through trainings and technical assistance and forming communities of practice and all sorts of different lenses. We operate on 3 levels. One is the most basic awareness level. That's on our website. We have toolkits and we have videos and we have tip sheets and lots of great information that's out there, and that's available to anyone nationally. So please feel free to stop by our website, download some information, give me feedback on it. We also provide a fair amount of assessment and coaching. So we use a national tool called the Trauma Informed Organizational Assessment. It was developed by our partners at the NCTSN, the National Center for Traumatic Stress Network. I think I got many of those letters right, and if not, just go with it. So we use their tool, the Trauma Informed Organizational Assessment, and we work with providers to say, where are you on your trauma and resilience journey? Everyone who is on this call has at least started the journey. You may be much further along, but you've at least decided, I want to become more trauma informed. I want to know how trauma and the science of trauma and the kids that are affected by trauma, how we can help. So you're already on that journey. Where are you on that journey? We then use the information that we get out of that assessment to plan individualized coaching, solving trauma. Solving any of the problems we face as mostly human service workers is not done in a day, but there are tips and information that we can share to help organizations along that journey. We also form what we call professional learning communities out of our learning communities and system transformation work, where we work in particular sectors like juvenile justice, child welfare, education, early education and care, all of these different sectors that impact kids. The biggest thing that cuts across absolutely everything we do is that we keep a racial equity lens on. So we make sure that we are looking at things from an equitable standpoint. While I said Massachusetts is great for kids in general, there's a lot of disproportionality, particularly right now. We have a huge growing Latino population in some of our child serving systems. There's also disproportionality of African-American kids and immigrant children. So we really try to keep that lens on how we can support the workforce and the providers that work with those kids. We have 5, we call them our 5 golden principles of safety, transparency and trust, empowerment, voice and choice, equity, anti-bias effort and cultural affirmation, and healthy relationships and interactions. And that really is the underpinning of absolutely everything we do. And if we get a little bit more time in this conversation, I can tell you how each of those principles can translate into ways to support your workforce that works with children and families to try to make the workforce more trauma responsive and resilient.
Thanks, Audrey. So let's dive a little more into the substance here in terms of the specific things you're doing, you've done, and how you came to be. Justin, let's start with you. You and Audrey are both part of state government. Can you talk a little bit more about how your office came to be on the trauma responsive track?
Sure. Yeah. So I started with the agency as director for DHS in June of 2019. I had been exposed to the resilience film a few times in my prior world, and always left the viewing of that where it made complete sense that we're just a sort of a byproduct of the experiences in our life, whether good or bad. And I then always wanted to know what do we do about it? Like, what's next? And so as I came into the agency, I immediately just recognized trauma really all over the place. Of course, the folks who come to work for the Department of Human Services really come for a reason. They generally have some lived experience, or they've got some passion built around really difficult work. The work that we do also perpetuates trauma in our agency. And so it was everywhere, a deficit mindset, defensive thinking. And so we started to really understand this concept of the science of hope. And so it was all really a strategy that we built early on with some really incredible partners within the agency to think about this continuum. How do we start from where we are, recognizing that each of our 6,000 employees comes to this work from a different place, and they're sitting currently in a different space in their understanding of trauma. And so how do we build the continuum that meets people where they are and moves forward, all with common language and vision? And so that happened in June of 19. I think here in a little bit, we'll talk some about outcomes, and the outcomes have been pretty dramatic from my perspective.
Thanks, Justin. Audrey, you mentioned that you got money legislatively. Can you just give us a little bit of history about how your work came to be, how it moved forward?
Absolutely. So much like Justin, I became aware that the key piece that cut through all of the human service workforce, and to be honest, I feel like by now the key piece that cuts across all workforce right now, given what we've gone through in the last few years, really was trauma. So in 2018, I started taking some of the research. There was a lot of research out there on trying to get out information on what is the brain science of trauma. I called that the sort of first trauma 101 phase. This is your brain on trauma, which was incredible for setting that groundwork. What there was a lot of action about what can we do about it. And I think one of the gifts, if I can use that term, of COVID has been that we are much more sensitive to what trauma can do, whether it's full system trauma, like we just went through with this, whether it's racial injustice and how that impacts various sectors differently, or the trauma we more traditionally think of as the adverse childhood experiences, that it is really creating a difference in our workforce. So we started doing a series on trauma, race, and resilience. At the very same time, our partners in the Office of the Child Advocate had formed a childhood trauma task force. It was really trying to dive into what happens to kids when they're young and how that impacts their ability to function in the world, and then how it really impacts their ability to become corporate citizens and go on to be in the workforce. They had been working with the legislature for several years, and really, in a strange way, we got a little bit lucky that there was a mental health crisis and there was COVID, because there was much more of a focus on what do we need to invest on, because otherwise our state's going to fall apart. So they allocated some funding. I think in our first year we got 300,000, then we got 1.3 million, and this year we're operating in a 3.5 million budget. And I give you those numbers just to give you a sense that once you bring in the legislature or private funding, depending on how your state or your situation works, there is a fair amount of desire to try to put funds in, because what you're really selling them, and I believe in this quite a bit in terms of results, is the workforce will be better, the economy will be better, us as citizens will be better, us as family members will be better. It's a very small investment for a pretty large return.
Thank you. And I do want to invite people. I know there's some active conversation going on in the chat. I want to encourage people. We know that a lot of you are working in organizations at various stages of becoming more trauma informed and responsive. And we'd love for you to kind of share some of the changes and outcomes you've seen. But like now we'd like to talk a little bit about some short and long-term outcomes organizations can hope to achieve by becoming trauma responsive, and whether or not there are metrics by which organizations can and should measure their internal success. So Vicki, let's start with you.
Sure. So we measure things at various levels. We always start with the immediate metrics after a training to see if the learning, the training was useful for people's learning. And we're always making sure that we improve the trainings if folks were not able to grasp the concepts, as Audrey mentioned with the training that they do. We do very similar things, but for the adults. We also measure on sort of an annual basis how useful our work has been, including the training, but also the organizational coaching that we do with organizations. And I was really heartened to see in Detroit, after the first year worth of trainings and coachings that we did with the career centers there, that and it was really interesting. We asked people to say how many trainings or experiences they had participated in. So the first question we asked was, did you feel that the training was useful? And folks who had taken 1 to 3 trainings or participated in something related to this 1 to 3 times throughout the year, 67% said that it was useful. It was like, oh, that's okay, but you know, I'd like to see more. So then we looked at the people who had taken 4 to 6 trainings, and 76% said that it had been useful. And that was about the same for folks who had taken 7 or more trainings. So we really found that the more trainings people participate in, the more knowledge that they are building, the more times they have to practice with this, because all of our trainings are experiential too, because this is behavior change. This isn't just knowledge building. This is actually us changing our practices and our behaviors. The more times people have to practice and experience that, the more they find it useful. So it provides a case for why we can't just be doing one-off 1-hour webinars or 2-hour webinars for this type of work. We also asked them if they used what they learned in their professional work. And again, the folks who had only experienced 1 to 3 treatments or experiences, 53% said, yeah, I use it in my work. But when they had 4 to 6 opportunities to practice with these new skills, 76% said that they used it in their professional work. So we're starting to see it actually become part of the way they do their work, the way they do business, the way their organizations operate. So anyway, we ask those questions on an annual basis. We also measure organizational culture change, much like Audrey described with her organization and how she works with organizations. For us, we've been using the professional quality of life assessment and the trauma-informed climate scale. And both of those really offer staff an opportunity to share how they feel about how supported they are with their organization, how happy they are, how satisfied they are with their job, if they're experiencing burnout, if they're experiencing too much secondary stress. So that allows us to sort of start to get at that climate, that organizational culture. We also use the everyday discrimination scale in order to be able to inform how much discrimination staff of color in particular are experiencing. And that really helps us inform what we should be talking about in our race-based trauma training sessions and action labs that we do. Ultimately, we hope to be able to measure and correlate more hard employment outcomes like reduced turnover, improved retention, improved service delivery. But I got to be honest with you, and I think that Justin and Audrey would agree with me that the field is just not there yet. I mean, folks, we have just been doing this since the onset of COVID, and racial reckoning brought trauma and toxic stress to the surface, made it so obvious that we had to really start focusing on that. And it's only been, 3 years now, 2 or 3 years. So we don't want to rush measuring things when we don't quite have the coaching and the training worked out to make sure that what we are measuring with those harder outcome measures are really based on good treatments and good interventions.
Thanks so much, Vicki. Audrey, anything you'd like to add?
I want to add how awesome Vicki is. I think that she is totally great. So we have a ton of statistics, as you might imagine, working in an academic medical center, which is where the center is housed, where I am housed. We really focus on measuring things quite a bit. So I have a lot of statistics on people saying they love the training. This was so great. Very similar to what Vicki shared about dose response, or we call it dose response in the medical school setting of the longer you are involved in it, the more you are saying, oh, I really can change policies. I really can change the physical environment to be better. The more you get out of it. We similarly have moved significantly away from the one and done training, unless it is just to try to reel somebody in to say, okay, here's a little taste of trauma and resilience work to try to get them in more. But those one and done really or check the box type training. So we do measure that. I would say in terms of our logic model, which really sat down to say, okay, we want kids doing better. How do we get there? We are very much still, as Vicki said, in the short-term space. How many people go to trainings? I will say the biggest measures of success that we have right now is that every single child serving agency in Massachusetts has come to us and started an intervention. The intervention looks different in each system. Child welfare is not going to necessarily have the same trauma responsive and resilience building profile and journey that we see at our Department of Transitional Assistance, but every single child serving agency has come in for an intervention. We are involved with almost half of all the congregate care settings, doing a really deep dive and analysis of where they are and making transformational change. And I will say, when we have them take the trauma-informed organizational assessment at the start and then at the end, it is dramatic to see the changes. And that's even in just a very short period of time. So I can share all of those numbers with you. I do want to just mention that what gets measured gets changed. So if people are really looking, if you're on this call and you're saying, so where do we start? Start by looking at what are you measuring as an organization to be successful. There's no one size fits all for all 200 of you on this call. But when you're saying, are we successful as an organization? Look at your metrics to see, are we doing things that are trauma responsive, and what do those look like in terms of either the principles I cited or the principles Justin cited? There is nothing magic about some of these words, but there is something magic about saying, am I looking at the workforce from a trauma and resilience lens, and how am I measuring progress? And I think people will find that incredibly satisfying. And we do know that it results in retention of human service workers for the work that we've started doing, and a lot of other studies out there as well.
Thank you. And I see that we've got an active chat going on here. Vicki, we have a question for you about whether all those measures you share, are you using those all separately, or do you put the questions all together into one large assessment, and how often do you reassess?
All right, I was just typing the answer in the chat, but it's so much easier to say it verbally. So we do put all the questions together in one assessment, and we do it approximately annually. On the trauma-informed climate questionnaire, we use the shorter version, which has 10 questions, the TICS 10. And I have to say that I am not really happy with the questions because a lot of them are deficit-based. So we, in this next year, are actually going to change the questions to be more positive, which will not allow us to compare our answers nationally, but I would rather have more positive questions and not re-traumatize people with the questions in the TICS 10 the way that it's stated now. So that's a decision and a weighing that you all will have to do. I also want to put a call out to Dr. Jessica Camp, who's on the webinar. She is our expert on these assessments, and she's been doing all the training and coaching in Detroit and on the New Hampshire work. So thank you, Jess, and if you've got any other things you want to add, put it in the chat, or we can add it later. Thank you, though.
Thanks, Vicki. Yeah, and people are definitely answering one another's questions and asking some, so please keep it up. I'm gonna go to Justin now. Can you tell us a little bit more about what success looks like for you as you work towards becoming a trauma responsive workforce, and how you see the work ultimately impacting the individuals who use your services?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a workforce perspective, we've already started to see outcomes, we believe. So we launched into the HOPE work and the trauma resiliency work in 2019. So we've had 3 years of consecutive surveys within our agency. And we survey many of the same things that have already been brought up here. What has been interesting is as we've added that HOPE science layer to the work, and we do work directly with Dr. Chan Hellman, who is the author of the Hope Rising, and really sort of one of the leading researchers in the science of hope. We work directly with him, and he is a quantitative researcher. So he brings in all of the data teams and all that stuff where doesn't fall upon us in the human services space to understand how all that works. However, what we have seen is as hope increases, and so hope is measurable, and I'll give just a quick summary. A child's hope score is based on 36 points, and a 2-point increase in a child's hope score has been proven to result in a letter grade increase in school. And so it is measurable. And so we've measured hope 3 consecutive years in our workforce. And so we tied those hope measurements also to those questions around burnout and intent to stay and work-life balance and job satisfaction and all of those things. And we have shown a rise in our hope scores, which has resulted also in a reduction in some of those other sort of negative measures and an increase in the positive measures, all of which we believe built the framework for us. We've experienced a 17% reduction in turnover in the last 3 years at the state's largest agency. And so now we can't directly tie every single person who stayed and didn't leave to the framework that we've developed on the science of hope, but we do believe that we've been successful. People are using the common language. They're creating partnerships in the community. And so we do believe that the science of hope has been transformational for us internally. The second piece, I mentioned hope scores. We are now also building technology, and this is specific to the question around going into the community itself and the people we serve. We've built the technology to begin to measure hope in the people that we serve as we serve them. So when you can imagine if you're coming to be served by the safety net programs, and the moment you engage for the first time, the first sort of intake assessment includes the questions around the science of hope. And so we measure your hope score on the onset of our relationship. Then as we move forward and we provide, maybe it's SNAP benefits as the first intervention, we have an opportunity to measure hope again. So we can see the places in which we provide interventions and specific interventions at the right time, improve hope scores at certain times in people's journey. So we've built the infrastructure for that and started to do it. We have yet to see the actual outcomes because it's been early to some of the points that we've already brought up. But that's one area in which we've taken the hope-centered and trauma-centered culture of our workforce into the field itself to serve directly for our customers. Part of the hope training and the platform that we built also includes this concept of hope navigators and ambassadors. And the idea is to embed people who are deeply engaged in the work to with the tools and knowledge to build structures and programs that can be expected to improve hope in the people we serve. So we've moved all into that space. We've seen strong outcomes for the framework that we've built in our workforce, and now starting to really take them to the people that we serve, 1.5 million Oklahomans.
Thanks so much, Justin. We have a question here which points to the fact that, this sounds lovely and it sounds easy, but when it actually comes down to implementing, it can be hard, particularly where we have companies and firms that are profit driven. And is there, recognizing that this isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do, even though it's important. So Audrey, I know you and I have talked about this a lot, about what it means to, as an organization, become trauma responsive. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to this.
Sure. First, I just have to acknowledge how many of you just feel more hopeful hearing Justin speak. You've got this amazing, and Vicky too, absolutely, but this amazing story to tell. And my hope is going up by it. So thank you, Lauren. Let me focus a little bit on the question. I started by saying how happy I was that we have almost 200 people on the call, because to me, that is very hopeful in saying how many people want to make change. So I hear what people feel and say in terms of, but I can't solve all of it. For those of you guys who celebrate some of the spring religious holidays, I happen to celebrate Passover. So we have just been reading a lot of Passover pieces. And there is a quote that I want to share with everybody. It's from Pirkat Aboth, which is from the Talmud from about, I would say maybe 3,000 years ago. And it's a great quote. And it says, "You are not required to finish the work, but neither are you permitted to desist from it." And the reason I share that is because we are not going to, we on this call, and we potentially even on our lifetime are not going to solve all of the areas that bring up trauma. We are not going to solve poverty. And we are not going to solely solve discrimination, but we're not going to step away from it because of the barriers. So there are a lot of barriers, but I'm going to go over a few of them and approaches to them, but I want to say there's a lot that we can do. So even if the work is never going to be completely solved, there will still be a child welfare system and kids in need. There will still be a juvenile justice system. There will still be poverty, but there are pieces that we can do. So in terms of some of the barriers for organizations, we often have organizations say, I don't have time and I don't have money. Those tend to be some of the bigger barriers. And what I encourage people to do is really say, what are the steps you can take now? Where can you start your journey now? So we have, and you can see them on our website, we have 5 guiding principles that I talked about and 5 action steps. And I'm going to run through them, but please know they're out there. I can send you a 1-pager. I can meet with you personally to walk you through where some places are that you could just start now. But just taking one of them, policy and decision making. Look at your policies. See if they are trauma responsive. If that doesn't ring true to you or you don't know how to approach that, reach out to one of us on the call. We can walk you through some of it. Does that mean you can ignore any policy? No, but it does mean you can say, where do I bring trust and transparency to this policy? So I'm just going to give one specific example. We work with the Department of, it's in Massachusetts, it's called DHCD, but it's basically housing. And they asked us to consult on their family shelters. And they said, but we have to have a lot of policies in place. When someone violates these policies, we remove them from shelter. Okay, but how do you phrase them? Do you have the why up there? To provide the why of a policy is much more trauma responsive than you broke a rule, we're kicking you out of the shelter. Very similarly, if you're in transitional assistance, which is what we call our TANF program in Massachusetts, It's very different to say we are sanctioning you and we are removing you and not explain it. It's much more trauma responsive to say, here's the pathways to how we are providing this grant and support for you. How can we work within these pathways? And if you're getting off the path, how can we work with you to get back on? So you can start at almost any particular point and remove those barriers. Now, would I love to see each of your organizations take every single policy, go through a review, build in trainings on trauma responsiveness, change your physical environment, and monitor continuously? I absolutely would, but maybe you're not there yet. So it isn't up to you to finish the work, to abolish poverty, although I wish it were. I wish I had that in my power or the power of any of us on this call, but it is up to us to start the journey and take each of those barriers and see how you can work on them. I think it can be very intimidating if you go to leadership and say, we're going to become trauma responsive and we're going to blow up a lot of what we do. Instead of, we're going to see if there is a way to support our workforce better so that when they go out there and they say, well, we need to sanction this person, they will have a common language that is trauma responsive to say, let me explain the why. Let me be transparent about what we are doing and let me build a healthy relationship so that we can grow that person. So does that address the question a little bit, Lauren?
It does. I think Vicki wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, that was such a great answer, Audrey. Thank you. And I just want to reinforce that I always tell people, look, this stuff is not rocket science. It is brain science, but it's not rocket science. So we can do this. It's just a matter of understanding those principles in that framework and how we can change the things that we do on an everyday basis and just tilt them, pivot them a little bit to be more trauma informed and responsive. So one thing that we've done is a trauma and resilience at work quick guide series, which I'm sure Lizzie will put in the chat. And we started looking at the SAMHSA framework that Audrey uses. Her five principles framework is based on the SAMHSA one that we use often. And we started writing like some of the specific action plans or action items that you can do under each of the principles. And so like trustworthiness and transparency, I mean, I myself was kind of shocked when I was like, well, it's really just, a good example is to provide multiple means of communication about a big announcement with the organization, monthly meetings with leadership, staff meetings, check-ins, just making sure that people feel like they get the communication and it's in multiple ways. That itself is trauma informed, and that's just a good way to operate your organization and a good way to be a good manager. So there's a big Venn diagram actually between being trauma informed, job quality, just being a good manager and having basic good work protocols in place, and having a racial equity and inclusive organization. When you look at all three of those, there's a ton of overlap between what we're doing here. So when you're making progress on being more trauma informed and being a more supportive organization, you're making progress on better job quality, you're making progress on having a racially equitable and inclusive organization as well.
Thank you, Vicki. So we kind of addressed a bit of a barrier there, but I kind of want to more explicitly talk a little bit about what are some of the common barriers to adopting a trauma responsive approach in government agencies and other organizations, and how can they be overcome? I don't know, Audrey, if you want to add anything else on that front, and then we'll go to you, Justin.
So I would say the biggest things that I hear when I go into organizations are, we would love to become trauma responsive, and the two buts are time and money. I am constantly hearing we have so much to train people on, and we have to do so many requirements, whether those are federal requirements or state requirements or requirements that seem to come out of nowhere, because as governments, we're pretty good at coming up with those things. It's time, and then it's money. We don't have the money to hire trainers. We don't have the money to do all of this work. In terms of the money, we spend a lot of time providing articles, and we're happy to share them with you as well. And Vicki has alluded to a few of them, that you will save money for your workforce by keeping your people doing well. Now, we probably on this call talk about supporting well-being of human beings because we think that's the right thing to do. But it is also the right thing to do if you just want to save money. So I do have a pretty good answer on the money thing. It is spending money now so that you can have less turnover, you have better retention, you have a less stressed workforce, which will result in better opportunities and interactions for your customers, whatever the field may be. The customers in my case are little kids, but no matter what, if you have a very stressed, traumatized workforce, it's not going to be positive customer experiences. In terms of the time, I try to be very honest with organizations that yes, this work takes time. This is not an easy fix because this was not an easy problem. It didn't grow overnight. So we're talking about decades and decades of how we have worked with people and treated people in the workforce. But the biggest response is you are actually going to save time by making people feel like they have some agency and autonomy in their roles. So they can then, when they interact with whoever they interact with, be more positive, bring that feeling of resilience and positivity forward. One of the biggest things we train on is reflective supervision. And I heard a comment that said, you know, it'll take time to retrain all of the supervisors in reflective supervision, but it's very easy to then point out, yes, but the frontline staff who are being supervised that way can be so much more effective in their role, therefore saving a lot of supervisory time. But I would say the biggest barriers we hear about are time and money. I did also see in the chat, I can't remember what state somebody mentioned it from, but somebody said they're just keeping their head down because it's not feeling very hopeful. I am not a Pollyanna by any stretch of the imagination. I am not saying this is easy. And I am not saying that there aren't pressures in various states right now that are not taking humanistic views towards vulnerable populations. So let's be real about that. But let's also be real about the fact there's other ways of getting there. You could say to someone in whatever state that was, that said they're just kind of keeping their head down, that great, this will save you time and money. Great, this will better support kids so you don't have to spend as much money in the juvenile justice system. And wouldn't that be great for your bottom line and for getting reelected? You can try to see things through different lenses so that you can still provide the information out there. That said, I hear you. Sometimes it's hard. And I want to acknowledge that by being on the call and by undertaking this work, you are taking a great step. And that gives me hope and hopefully can take some hope back to whatever home state that was.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. Audrey provided a really wonderful assessment of the primary barriers, time and money are the two primary. The way that really I think about that is, first of all, I would like to share that from a time perspective, there is a ton of training that we have to do in the Department of Human Services with 7 different program divisions. They all have their own. However, our training on trauma and the science of hope is the only mandatory training in the entire agency. So you have to do that in order to be an employee at DHS. We also have ingrained it into our onboarding process as well. So when you do your initial sort of meetings at the agency to understand what the culture looks like, we drive home this work as well. So it's a long-term approach, but honestly, what's required to overcome the barrier is just leadership in some cases. You just have to state that this is a priority. You have to create a common language, and Audrey has said that once or twice on this call. It's so important, common language, and just prioritizing it as well. And from a financial perspective, another place that it's been powerful for us is we've partnered with other organizations to bring the same training in. So while we're doing hope training in some spaces and the brain science training, we're also bringing in outside partners so that they can have the training for free because we're paying for it. So if there is an organization that does have budget, building the common language, common philosophies through leadership and bringing other organizations to the table will help create an overall landscape of folks who understand the work that we're all trying to do. So those are just the first couple of things that came to mind as I was thinking about resolving barriers.
Fantastic. And I see Vicki added some thoughts in the chat here on this. So I wanted to know, as we think about, if you were to think of one critical element for success, we hear about things often like buy-in from staff, sustainability of funding sources, champions at senior levels. What is it for you all that you feel like is critical? And we can start with Vicki.
Trust and open-mindedness. I would say to trust your staff to cultivate supportive, trauma-responsive cultures. That's the one thing that we've learned in Detroit, is that when leaders trust their staff to say what they need and to allow them to implement what they need, not only do they get what they need, but it's also empowering for staff, which is one of the principles that is resilience building and trauma responsive. And I would say that leaders, and this is just a mindset shift, as Justin said about leadership, is that staff need to be open-minded about what staff say they need, and really listen to them. So it can't be a top-down, this is what I read in a book, this is what I think you need. It's really important to listen to staff, hear what they need, help them implement it, help make the organizational changes that are necessary. And that can be hard for some leaders who, when they're stressed. So that's the other thing, is that leaders get stressed, and leaders will go through some of the trauma responses that we're training people on, in terms of this is what to look for in your customers, or this is what to look for in your staff. So recognizing that they will experience these symptoms and signs as well, and helping them with psychological safety, so that way they can be less constraining and less control oriented and more open-minded and more relaxed, to trust each other and trust that the team can collaboratively cultivate a more supportive culture and climate.
Perfect. Anyone else want to chime in on this one? Critical success factor.
I would just add, and I think I saw a question pop up about this. Create psychological safety in your organization. If you can do one thing out of this call, and I hope you can do so many things, or like so many things once you look up some of the resources, but creating psychological safety, which means that employees can speak up and feel safe. They still have to be appropriate. They still have to get the work done, but they can feel safe making mistakes. They can feel safe asking for what they need. It doesn't mean if they say they need a month off that you can easily grant that, but they're safe asking, they're safe making mistakes, they're safe saying what their needs are, so that you as leaders can then be responsive to that. And there are great resources on how to build psychological safety in the workplace. We can send some of them out later, or if we get a chance, I can put some of them in the chat. But creating that psychological safety around what employees can bring forward and how as a team you can build that resilience, it is very important. Other than that, though, also follow all of our action steps and all of our guiding principles, because I can't do just one. I know Lauren wanted one. There's a lot.
So the thing I would mention in follow-up, we've mentioned it already twice, but I'll bring it home, is common language is critical. But the other we've mentioned is outcomes. And for me, as we started to engage with what outcomes we were searching for as we began this work, it was very clear that this is all the right thing to do, not just because it's right for people, but it's also right for outcomes. And if the work that you're doing doesn't achieve the outcomes, that means we're probably doing something wrong. So I would encourage folks to identify the outcomes that mean something for them, and then seek those through this framework, and you will find them, because the work we're doing is the right work. So those are the two things I would say, is common language and start with outcomes.
And Justin, we got a sort of specific question for you. So I don't know if you'll know this off the top of your head. Somebody was asking about how many modules are part of the staff-wide trauma and science of hope training. I don't know if you.
Yeah, good question. So I'm going to go a little bit off the cuff here. So if give me some grace, I appreciate that. So the agency-wide training, I believe, is 4 hours with 8 modules, between 6 and 8 modules that you do sort of sporadically. You don't have to do it all in one setting. We also have executive leadership training, which is in person, a full day, I believe. And that is really building hope building strategies. And that's probably, in an agency of 6,000 people, probably the 200 or so sort of primary leaders. And then we also have what we call Hope Navigator and Ambassador training, which are 2 full days after you've done those other things as well. And there's a train the trainer component, so that we can embrace it in the sort of onboarding and all that. And it's also around building structures in developmental disabilities or in aging services, or whatever that division is, that are hope building and trauma responsive strategies. So there's multiple different, but the agency wide, I think, is 4 hours with 8 modules over a few days.
Perfect. Thank you. So as we think about organizations that are brand new to this, they don't have funding yet or approval for training, maybe their leadership doesn't really know anything about this. What are some of like the very first steps that they could take to get started here? And Audrey, do you want to start here?
Sure. I think we were all doing the who wants to hop in first thing. I really would start gathering some information. If you've really done nothing in the trauma and resilience space, you do want to start with the basics on what is trauma, how does it affect the brains of your workers, of the population that you serve, and go from there. You need that basic knowledge. If for no other reason, it shapes everything else that comes after, and it will also be a really powerful way to provide to your leadership why you are doing this. You need to have the why, or you never get to the change. So whether the why is because it's the right thing to do, or it builds healthier children, or it maintains your workforce better, you need that knowledge to get to the why. So I would start with that knowledge base. That's relatively easy to come by. Go to our website, go to Wiki's website, learn anything you can from Justin because he's amazing. That information is out there. It's taking that information to the very next step. I have a roadmap, which I'd be happy to send to anybody afterwards. I don't know that we really have time to pull it up, although I think we could maybe put it in the chat, Lizzie. I'll leave that to you, but we go in phases, and it provides you with steps of, okay, start here, just become trauma conscious. Now, are we trauma aligned? Are we looking at all of our leadership team? That's going to move us to the next step. Okay, then we get trauma informed. We share that information with our entire organization, all the way up to trauma responsive and organizational sustainability. And finally, resilience responsive, which is sort of that last phase. But if you're really starting from the very beginning, gather information and gather how it impacts your community, your staff. Oh, it looks like we will have it up here. So we don't have time for me to walk you guys all the way through this, but I'm happy to have it be sent out afterwards. But the thing that I really like about this is that you can come in at any phase, and depending on where you are as an organization, you know, I would say Vicky's team and Justin's team, they're off my chart. They're at resilience building and resilience promoting, but you can start anywhere, even if it's just trauma conscious awareness of how trauma is impacting your workforce and the people that ultimately you serve. And then start with, okay, is your agency ready for change next? Why? How are we going to do this? And go all the way through the phases. So I don't want to dominate the rest of the time that we have, but we can send this out as a roadmap to start here, start wherever you are, and then go from there.
Thank you. And when we write takeaways from each session, so when we post the takeaways, we can at that point, I imagine, Audrey, you'll have it online and we can link to it. So Vicky or Justin, do either one of you want to share next?
Yeah, I'll go next so Vicky can bring us home. Mine is quick, and it just jumps off of what Audrey just shared. This concept of understanding and learning about sort of all of the science behind trauma is probably the first step. It allows for you to build your words to connect and embrace leaders, of which you will be one. Don't put it on someone else. This is yours, to the quote earlier. And this all makes sense as you dig in and understand it. It makes sense. And so leaders who will be partners in the work will very much be aligned. It is not rocket science, but it's brain science. That was a good one. I'm going to bring that one to my office. But that's how I would is just start to learn and share it with others around you.
I can't add to Audrey and Justin without adding more, but there was a question that we got as well, which was, how do we get senior leadership to be open to this stuff? And so I can provide a little bit on that. And I'm with Justin, and Audrey has mentioned it too, is ground the work in the brain science because it feels less squishy to leaders. And also you get out of the potential of being called a snowflake. Because I tell people, would you call a Marine who has PTSD a snowflake? I don't think so, but that's the exact same brain science. And also when we describe this work to leaders, when I get a chance to actually train the leadership in an organization and we base it in the brain science, they get it because they're stressed too, because they're experiencing fight, flight, freeze, or submit. And so then when they start to feel it and then they get it, then I think that's when we actually start to get some traction on getting some organizational systems changed. So, leaders are human too.
Yeah, on the
Fantastic.
leadership perspective, if you, honestly, I've said it a few times, the outcomes piece is so important because you can go up to somebody and maybe they don't understand all the science and they feel like, you're coming from a specific political lens, but just say that Oklahoma Human Services saw a 17% reduction in turnover. There are outcomes associated with this. And if you just engage with those, that's as much argument as is needed for anyone.
Fantastic. Audrey, did you want to?
I just want to resonate one thing that I just saw pop up in the chat about screening, because I would say, in addition to how can you prove this is making a difference, the biggest question I get is, should we screen for trauma? And I just want to put a caution out there, or identify for trauma. Screening can also provoke a lot of feelings in people. And the last thing you want to do is create a lot of feelings that you are not ready or prepared to handle. Even if you're doing it anonymously, you're asking people to dredge up what may very well be the most painful part of their life. They may have never processed or dealt with it. So you really want to kind of think through whether it makes sense to do that kind of screening. I can almost guarantee you your workforce has experienced trauma. And does it really matter in a way if you know that it's 80% has some trauma, or 90% or 20%? You want interventions that promote resiliency because it's good for the workforce. It's good for everybody. So just kind of everybody has gone through a really rough few years. People of color have gone through a really rough period of time. You probably don't need more information than that to know that your workforce could use some resiliency supports.
I do want to note, because we're getting lots of questions and comments about resources. We are actually going to have a session about screening and assessment coming up in, I believe it'll be September. We have a lot of great sessions coming up, but we will be addressing, to Audrey's point, if you're going to screen, if you're going to assess, that you need to make sure you have the supports in place when you're doing that. And then I did also want to mention that we do have a resource library. A lot of the resources that were mentioned here today are going to be available. Actually, some of them already are available in the resource library. We'll also have more of them that are addressed here today in our takeaways that we write up. The whole recording will be available. I also did want to note that one of our steering committee member partners, CTIP, has a trauma-informed workplace toolkit that recently came out. So encourage you to look at that. That is on there as well. So there are a ton of resources. I did want to ask if any of you have final thoughts before I conclude. I can start with Vicki. You just have 2 minutes, so.
Awesome. Okay, so the last question you asked us was, what should state policymakers be doing? Number one, fund and provide adequate time and space for training and organizational coaching across and throughout the system, workforce development system, human services, et cetera, et cetera. Number two, review the policies of that system and see if they are trauma informed, if they are causing stress and trauma, how supportive of resilience building are they, not only for individuals, but at the organizational and the community level.
Wonderful. Justin, 2 action items, takeaways for state government.
Sure. I would just submit that it's patience and grace. This is hard work. It takes a long time. It is right, so stick with it. But grace, there will be mistakes made, and we're all trying to learn this together and build communities of resilience and hope. And so those are my 2, patience and grace.
All right, Audrey.
I just have a lot of gratitude for everybody that's on the call today. And I wish you all to give yourselves a lot of compassion. You gave us some of your time. Give yourself some compassion for the hard work that you are doing. Special shout out to my friends in some states that are maybe not as supportive of this work as Massachusetts, and continuously give yourself and your workforce some compassion for what they're going through. It's been a hard time, but the sun is out and things are moving in the right direction. Hang on to that hope.
Thank you. I really, truly want to thank our amazing speakers today. This session got the highest registration of all of our sessions, which gives me hope for the focus on this and that people are really interested. I did want to remind everyone that our next session is going to be Wednesday, May 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern. The topic is trauma-informed design and creating safe, comfortable spaces in all sectors. Lizzie may be able to share the link for that. That is another way to think about being trauma responsive. We're going to be featuring some architects in a couple of different states and some of the and folks who have worked across sectors, everything from working with child welfare to housing and homelessness to jails. So we'll be hearing a lot about how to think about designing spaces. So strongly encourage folks to check out that session again, May 17th. I want to thank everyone today for joining us and hanging in there. This has been a fantastic session. Justin, Audrey, Vicki, thank you so much. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.